This flight is just a quick 35-mile repositioning from Edinburgh to Glasgow without any passengers on board. A good opportunity to get you checked out on the Bombardier CRJ 700. While we're waiting in line for takeoff, I'll explain a few things. Flying a modern jet isn't really all that different from flying a small prop plane. There are just a handful of key differences. The first thing you'll notice is how different the instrument panel looks. Instead of many small, round mechanical instruments, there are just a few large computer screens. Most of the information is the same, but the presentation is different.
World Travel 221, hold short runway 6 right, traffic is a 747 and final.
Holding short 6 right, World Travel 221.
That call was for another aircraft. We're Orbit 526. I'll handle the radios during this flight, so don't worry if you miss anything. I'll tell you what to do. The display on the left is the primary flight display, or PFD. It combines multiple instruments into one display. The blue and brown section in the middle of the PFD is an attitude indicator. The vertical tape on the left side shows airspeed, and the tape on the right side shows altitude. At the bottom in the middle is a horizontal situation indicator, which shows heading, and to the right of that is a vertical speed indicator. Glass displays like these take some time to get used to, but once you get the hang of it, you'll love them. The display to the right of the PFD is the navigation display, which shows a top-down view of the aircraft's position relative to navigational aids and the flight planned route. You can change how the map looks by using the format and range knobs on the left side of the panel. Try it now if you want to. Okay, the third display is the Engine Indication and Crew Alerting System, or ICAS. The default page shows engine information, gear and flap positions, fuel quantity, and warning and caution messages. You can scroll through the different ICAS screens by clicking the up and down buttons at the bottom of the display. Each screen provides information about a different aircraft system. For this flight, keep the engine gauges showing on the ICAS. The top gauges are labeled N1. As we fly, I'll give you suggested thrust settings. Use your joystick throttle lever or the F2 and F3 keys to move the N1 needles to the settings I suggest. The rows of buttons and knobs just below the windshield is the mode control panel for the autopilot. We won't be using the autopilot on this flight, so don't worry about any of that for now. A big difference between jets and piston aircraft is that in a jet, the engines take a while to spool up. This means that if you add or reduce thrust, there will be a slight delay before your action has any effect. This fact, combined with the jet's higher speed, means that you need to plan ahead.
World Travel 221, taxi into position and hold.
Position and hold, World Travel 221.
Jets have flaps just like piston aircraft. They're used during takeoff and landing to increase both lift and drag. Lower the flaps to 20 degrees for takeoff now by pressing the F7 key 3 times. You can see the flap indicator on the ICAS.
Orbit 526, hold short runway 6 right.
We'll hold short 6 right, Orbit 526. Okay, follow the 737 ahead of us, but hold short of the runway. Release the brakes by pressing the period key and apply some thrust to get us going. Good. Stop here. One last thing. During the takeoff roll, I'll call out 4 speeds. When I call 80 knots, glance at your airspeed tape to verify it's moving and indicating approximately the same speed as mine. When I call V1, it means we're at the speed where we're committed to taking off, because there isn't enough runway to stop at that point. When I say rotate, gently pull back on the stick and rotate the nose into the air. Finally, I'll call V2, when we reach the minimum safety speed at which we can safely climb on just one engine if there's a failure.
World Travel 221, winds calm, clear for takeoff.
World Travel 221, rolling.
Orbit 526, taxi into position and hold.
Position and hold, Orbit 526. Okay, we're cleared to taxi onto the runway, but not to take off yet. Taxi ahead and turn right onto the runway. Stop once you're on the runway and lined up with the center line. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. Press Shift 5 to display the overhead panel, and turn on the landing light by clicking the switch in the lower left corner. Then press Shift 5 again to close the overhead. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. Before we take off, let's review exactly what will happen. You'll control the aircraft, I'll handle the radios. I'll call out 80 knots, V1, rotate, and V2. When I say rotate, gently pull back on the stick to raise the nose to 15 degrees nose up on the primary flight display. I'll tell you to retract the landing gear once we're climbing. Once we reach 1,000 feet above the runway, I'll tell you to pitch down to 10 degrees nose up and to raise the flaps so we can accelerate. Our initial climb will be to our cruise altitude of 6,000 feet, and the departure controller will probably tell us to make a left turn to the west. I'll let you know when to turn.
Orbit 526, winds are calm, runway 6 right, clear for takeoff.
Cleared for takeoff, orbit 526. All right, we're cleared to go. When you're ready, use the throttle lever on your joystick or press the F3 key to add thrust. Start with 50% N1. Let the engine stabilize and then increase thrust to 100%. 80 knots. V1. Rotate. Slowly pitch up to 15 degrees. V2. Positive rate, gear up. Raise the landing gear by pressing the G key.
Orbit 526, contact departure.
Orbit 526, switching. Okay, move the stick to adjust pitch to 10 degrees nose up on the primary flight display, and raise the flaps. Reduce thrust to about 80% N1 to keep our speed below 250 knots. Climb and maintain 6,000 feet. Edinburgh departure, orbit 526 with you, climbing to 6,000.
Orbit 526, roger. Orbit 526, turn left, heading 270.
Left to 270, orbit 526. Okay, it's time for the turn. Make a nice easy left turn until our heading is 270 degrees. That's due west. Let's run through the after takeoff checklist. Landing gear, up. Flaps, up. Thrust set to 80% N1 for the climb. After takeoff checklist complete. Level off at 6,000 feet and reduce thrust to about 60% N1. That should give us about 250 knots. We'll stay low on this short flight, so don't exceed 250 knots and keep the landing lights on. This is standard practice below 10,000 feet.
Orbit 526, resume own navigation.
Resume own navigation, orbit 526. All right, we've been told to resume our own navigation. This means the controller will no longer be giving us vectors, and we should follow our filed flight plan. Our flight plan route takes us to a point that will line us up for an approach to Glasgow's runway 23, which is currently the active runway. You can use the mission compass to navigate to that point, or you can follow our flight plan on the map page of the navigation display. The pink line on the screen is the path we should be following. We're above our assigned altitude. Descend to 6,000 feet.
Orbit 526, contact Glasgow approach on 119.1.
Orbit 526 switching. Thanks. Glasgow approach, Orbit 526 with you.
Orbit 526, Glasgow approach. Good morning. Reduce speed to 210 knots. Expect vectors for the visual approach, runway 23 at Glasgow. Glasgow altimeter 29902.
Slowing to 210 and we'll expect the visual for runway 23, Orbit 526. Bring the thrust back to about 50% N1, then adjust it to maintain 210 knots. Since the weather's good, the controller will line us up with the runway and give us clearance to proceed to the airport visually once we have the runway in sight.
Orbit 526, descend and maintain 3000.
Descend and maintain 3000, Orbit 526. Okay, we've got clearance to descend to 3,000 feet. Reduce thrust to idle and gently push forward on the stick to take us down. Pitch to about 7 degrees nose down to maintain 210 knots as we descend. Okay, level off here at 3,000 feet and bring the thrust back up to about 50% N1 to maintain 210 knots.
Orbit 526, reduce speed to 180 knots.
Slowing to 180, Orbit 526. Okay, now reduce thrust a bit to slow to 180 knots. Pull back on the stick a bit to keep the nose from dropping. Maintain 3,000 feet as you slow down. Press F7 twice to lower the flaps to 8 degrees. The flaps will slow us down, so bring the thrust back up to about 60% N1 so we maintain 180 knots.
Orbit 526, turn left heading 230, vectors for the visual approach runway 23, report the runway in sight.
Left to 230, looking for the runway, Orbit 526. Here we go. Turn left to 230 degrees. We should see the runway straight ahead once we roll out. Okay, I see the runway. Approach, Orbit 526 has the runway in sight.
Orbit 526, cleared visual approach runway 23.
Cleared for the visual, Orbit 526. Reduce thrust to idle and begin descending towards the runway. Lower the landing gear by pressing G and lower full flaps as we slow down. Press F7 3 times. In a large aircraft like this, the speed you land at changes depending on how heavy you are. At our current weight, our final approach speed will be 130 knots. Adjust thrust to maintain 130 knots as we descend toward the runway.
Orbit 526, contact tower on 118.8.
Switching to tower now, orbit 526. Thanks. Glasgow Tower, orbit 526 with you on the visual approach for runway 23.
Orbit 526, Glasgow Tower, you're number 1. Cleared to land, runway 23. Wind calm.
Clear to land, orbit 526. We're cleared to land, so let's run through the before landing checklist. It's a short one. Landing gear, down. Flaps, set to 45 degrees. Landing checklist complete. Continue descending. Once we're about 50 feet over the runway, reduce thrust to idle and pull back on the stick slightly to touch down on the main wheels first. Then, slowly lower the nose. Nice landing.
Orbit 526, turn left next taxiway and contact ground on 121.7.
Ground on 121.7, orbit 526. Turn left on the next taxiway. Once you're clear of the runway, stop, Retract the flaps and turn off the landing lights. Glasgow ground, orbit 526, clear of 23.
Orbit 526, taxi to the gate. Follow the 737 on the taxiway all the way to the runway.
We'll follow the 37, orbit 526. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. Okay, just follow that 737 on the taxiway. He's going to the same ramp, just a different gate. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. Make a right turn into this area. Our gate is the last one on the right side. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. There's our gate at the end. Pull up to the jetway and stop. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick. 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 Stop here. Excellent job. You're over-controlling. Use less pressure on the stick.